Right, there is a Mexican standoff happening. Some would say it's always been happening.
Some would say it is congenital with Bitcoin itself. But that intro got me fired up.
That intro got me absolutely jacked.
In that intro, Clint Eastwood is the node runner with 0.1 Bitcoin in his hardware wallet that is connected to his home node. You know, the bad guys are ossifiers. You know, what a fun.
But it's like a buddy movie, like where the two buddies, they hate each other. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they cannot admit that they actually do deeply love each other. No homo, but they actually really, really like need each other, and they're on the run from the big bad state with whom we are all ultimately in conflict.
So I'm regarded, because I had no idea that was actually a clip from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Oh, it's not. I just made that up because I'm a huge like Western buddy movie fan.
That makes more sense.
Anyway, speaking of buddy movies, shout out to our sponsors, Botanix. Thanks for supporting. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Botanix. Botanix Labs is pioneering a new direction for DeFi with the first EVM L2 running on Bitcoin that's built to be forward secure, decentralized, and share gas fees generated by the network with users. See the future of DeFi at Botanix, botanixlabs.xyz.
The freshest license-free beats, by the way, coming out of your boy DJ CBS.
Exactly. And also the beginning of this, if you're listening to this, I probably cut it off for brevity. The beginning of this podcast was basically the full good, bad, and the ugly signature, like symphonic scene. Like the sound of it with, Clint Eastwood gunning down all the bad guys, riding the lightning. And that's funny because like, it feels like we're that classic other Mexican standoff scene in the office between Dwight, Andy, and Michael, where like we have kind of three major stakeholders here who all like they all want to come to consensus or not. I don't know. Yeah, go for it.
Are we? No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like, are we saying the three major stakeholders here, roughly speaking, are the developers, miners, and users? Like that's
I would say users, economic, whatever. So.
Now that being said, there are more substrata of stakeholders within Bitcoin consensus. If you want to learn more about all of the different stakeholders and their roles and their weight in a lot of these discussions for upgrades, highly recommend you go check out Steve Lee, Ren Cryptofishes, and Lynn Alden's paper that they released on this. Steve and Ren opened Op Next with the paper. It was my favorite talk just because I think it set the stage so beautifully for a lot of the stuff that we talked about over the conference.
Yeah, and so Colin and I are doing this Bitcoin Season 2 Writers Room on the heels of Op Next, which was a rousing success. We recommend by the time you listen to it, pretty much all of the videos and presentations will be uploaded to our website, blockspace.media. But in the spirit of like trying to have conversations about Bitcoin scaling, forks, covenant proposals, and the big boogeyman, which is activation, we've seen more people chime in. Like the conversation did not end at Op Next. In fact, that seemed to kind of reopen. Just kind of, I would say, I don't want to give. I will give us a little bit of credit. It has like forced open the conversation to like get people out there. And at the center of this is this morning, the day we're recording this on Thursday. James O'Brien put out a tweet called exactly what it's called. The consensus conundrum.
Bitcoin faces a one-of-a-kind leadership problem. And
and so I think Colin and I we're gonna use this we're gonna talk through this, and we're probably even gonna select some replies that are in it. For those of you degens who are listening to this and you're like, what are they talking about? This is in the op cat discussion. So if you're this profile picture wearing cat person, or if you're a hardcore great consensus cleanup person, I hope we can at least draw you in. But for the cat people, like this is how the actual soft fork happens, is we have to argue about it for God knows how long until we figure out what to actually do, and then someone does it.
And who is we in that conversation, Charlie?
I don't know, man.
Literally everyone, but no one knows.
No one knows. I'll probably start this out by I will share my screen, and I have a tweet from mine which I think summed up a good comment from Reardon during his presentation, where he said, I noticed we have this recursive definition of consensus. A soft fork doesn't have consensus because it doesn't have consensus. Why doesn't it have consensus? Because it doesn't have consensus. It is this ring around the rosy of there is this attitude often that, well, if we just had consensus, we would go and do a soft fork. We'd figure out how to soft fork. At the same time, there is a large camp which says, oh, you should not go and try to form consensus. That needs to magically appear. And so that is kind of
them up out of the fertile ground of discussion across all these different media online.
The same place that female dwarves come from. They spring out of the ground, as Gimli says. Like, so we're here, and then we have yesterday, this exchange between Jeremy, who spoke at our conference, and Luke. So Jeremy says, the Great Consensus Cleanup, for those of you who don't know what that is, the Great Consensus Cleanup is just a bunch of like housekeeping things there. Everyone agrees we need to do them to just basically smooth around some rough edges.
Custodial updates, like, and by custodial, I mean like literally janitorial, like Charlie was saying, that are not sexy at all, that are really only fully or appreciated or understood by a lot of the tech savvy or developers. I think this is a really good, important point to bring up, and we'll return to this. Stuff like this doesn't always get a bunch of weight behind it because people either don't understand it or it doesn't do anything cool for Bitcoin. But you start talking about covenants and smart contracts and other things, and then everybody loses their mind. the entire,
I'm just adopting some
investor
soft
sphere.
forks.
Yeah. I mean, and then normal users and regarded people like me think that would be pretty cool to have on Bitcoin. So there's this kind of schism between what is important for users and what developers think is important.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, the last soft fork we had, Jeremy Rubin did kind of drive forwards. That's a loaded term here, which was Taproot in 21. When Jeremy was he a lead maintainer of Core?
I don't think I don't know, but he was
Oh,
definitely heavily involved.
very
Yeah.
active at the forefront of a lot of the developers on Bitcoin Core. And he's talking about the great consensus cleanup, which is janitorial stuff that we eventually need to do to Bitcoin Core. And that everyone agrees this needs to happen. And nobody, as he says, can agree on how to actually do it. And Luke Dash Jr. chimes in, of course, BIP 8, which is one of the 2 BIPs which at least outlay a path forwards for how to activate a soft fork. BIP 8, quote, had consensus for Taproot until you decided to scuttle it, leaving nothing but confusion. And then Jeremy replies with a tweet from Luke from a year ago to the week where he says, where he's in reply to on this topic, Taproot activated with BIP 8, not 9. Implying that it is not literal direct contradiction that Luke has here, but it reads very contradictory.
I just don't even understand where he's coming from with this. And just a quick clarifying point. BIP 9 came before BIP 8, funnily enough, and BIP 9 outlays a method for activating a soft fork where it's essentially a miner activated soft fork. You get a certain amount of hash rate to signal support for something, and then it locks in. And after a certain amount of time elapses, it ends up activating. BIP 8 is similar to BIP 9, but it has two main differences. Is one, it uses the activation threshold for hash rate, to measure it, it uses block height rather than like a timestamp, which is better, I think, for Bitcoin's internal clock. The other thing is it does not reach the threshold necessary to activate an upgrade. It gives a flag day for activation through a user activated soft fork where nodes will update independently of what miners are doing. So it's kind of this brokering an agreement with miners saying, here, you signal for this thing, and if you signal for it, great, we're all in agreement. But if you don't, by the way, we have this activation method where we can do it without you regardless.
Yeah, it's almost like you come to a handshake deal and everybody's like, yeah, we want this deal to work. But then you also sign an agreement where if one of the parties who needs to act first typically doesn't show up with their side of the deal, the other party will just go walk into the house and take it. Yeah. Because we already agreed, but
basically saying we're all in agreement here, and if you don't agree with us, fuck you, we're doing it anyway. Which,
yeah, sometimes it can be kind of a semantics argument. Sometimes I wonder if it's just semantics all the way down, because
most things are.
Yeah, feels like we've been arguing in circles in the same way that we have The Office, Dwight, Michael, and Andy in a circle with guns drawn, pointing at each other. So this leads us to, I think, the meat of our conversation, which is this post from James O'Brien on Twitter as James OB. If you are listening to this, we'll try to read select parts, but if you're watching, I would just pull up that Twitter thread. It's the one that's got all the likes and all the comments today. And just to go through it, we recommend reading the whole thing. James O'Brien, as far as I'm aware, Colin, he's always had spicy takes, and he can be a little bit of a troll if he doesn't like something, but he's an important voice in the conversation of soft forks. And it's a very long thread where he had, I think he had Reindell and Justine, Mrs. Hoddle, review this, which generated a lot of discussion. Sorry?
Yeah, that's his wife.
Oh, see, I didn't. Yeah. See,
Bitcoin lore here. Don't want to they're pretty open about it. And also, just a quick point of clarification, I think it's James O'Byrne or Bernie. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think it's James O'Byrne. But he's a Bitcoin Core. He has been a Bitcoin Core contributor. I believe he also didn't he I think he might have helped Jeremy with CTV, or at least contributed ideas to it. And I also want to say that he help with Op Vault or author Op Vault?
Oh man, I mean,
man, we really didn't come prepared with show notes today. I think so. Yeah, it looks like he is. Yeah, he proposed Op Vault, which is kind of another Covenant's, related proposal. But anyway, he has some really good points in this Twitter essay, and I think this kind of strikes to the core of a lot of the problems that we're having currently. And the TLDR is that for the first time in a long time, Bitcoin Core is not driving consensus forward for a major protocol change that would require a soft fork. There is currently a vacuum that no one's really filled. We kind of talked about this at Op Next. On my panel, I made the point that it seems like a private company like Taproot Wizards are kind of filling the vacuum and really being vocal about their favored proposal for a future soft fork. But that is not sufficient enough to achieve consensus on something like OpCat. And so we're all kind of sitting here, sitting around with our dicks in our hands, wondering what's coming next. How do we move forward with this when the unspoken truth is, or kind of like the inconvenient truth that is not talked about enough, is that at the end of the day, every single major upgrade in Bitcoin has been pushed forward by stakeholders in Bitcoin Core.
Yeah, he talks about this. He, towards the top of the essay, says, the final say and big ideas were implicitly signed off by one guy, or maybe a small oligarchy of wizened autists. True. In many ways, there's really nothing wrong with this. This is how most open source projects operate. Oftentimes, they have benevolent dictators who, quote, make the call in times of high dimensional ambiguity. Everyone knows Guido and Linus and the based Christian SQ Lite guy. Those are inside jokes for some people. Given that, there are three factors that create the consensus conundrum facing Bitcoin right now. One, the old benevolent dictators or high caste oligarchy have abdicated their power, leaving a vacuum that shifts the project from conventional mode of operation to novel, never tried before mode, an attempt at some kind of supposedly meritocratic leaderlessness. As you said, Colin, like Bitcoin Core used to have kind of a person who led it, and it was Satoshi, and then it was Gavin Andresen, and then it was, I don't even remember who, but there's been like
most recently it was Vladimir Vanderlyn who left, I think last year, or like kind of said, I'm done being the lead maintainer. And when we say leader of Bitcoin Core, we mean the lead maintainer of the Bitcoin Core,
the dominant reference client for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin broader consensus. This is the client that everybody uses. There is always discussion on whether Bitcoin Core is Bitcoin or not. Not for this.
It's a semantics argument, and the answer is it is. I'm firmly in the camp that if your client is like 98% of all of the active nodes, then like what anyway.
I'm in the camp that if you can use Libre Relay to get stuff into Core, which is not within Core relay policy, but consent. Anyway, okay, whatever. Okay, so like there's not a person, there's not the village elder model to come down from Mount Sinai and say, these are the words that God has given us. We shall follow these commandments. Rather, it's that person no longer exists. This is kind of intentional, but it's also unspoken. That there's not a person. So
to complicate your biblical metaphor, which I love, it's almost like a Tower of Babel scenario where like we're no longer speaking one language with one person directing us, and now everyone has their own tongue, and we're all just running around shouting at each other like unintelligible idiots, and no one knows what to do next.
This is the Tower of Babel that maximalism built. Anyway.
Ooh, spicy take. I have to digest that one for a second.
I don't know if that'll be I don't know. I'm practicing being Michael Saylor and spitting out random unverified aphorisms just to confuse people and make
Bitcoin is the Tower of Babel that was successful and made it to heaven.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay. We need to do okay. Um,
We need to
so
do a
then,
show where we each take on a different persona within the
yeah.
Bitcoin ecosystem and
Oh
don't break
man.
character the entire time.
Oh man. Yeah, we could do like a holiday special. Okay, pin
That'd be
that
fun.
out.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to get off track.
So no. Then we have uh number 2 of James' point. The possible design space for improvements and things to care about in Bitcoin is wide open at this point. Doing vaults, more L2s, rollups, generational computational tooling like CAT. Can we bundle things? Can we do CTV and vault? And he says the problem is that all of these are valid options. They all have merit in terms of what to focus on and how to get to the end goal. There really isn't a clear, correct design pattern. So that's another thing is like, while many people will argue on all of these points, they will argue very strongly against rollups. They'll argue very strongly against generational computational tools. Um, there are camps in Bitcoin now that are representative of the Bitcoin user base, which advocate for these. So like they are in the discussion, and uh, and we have to once again figure out what Bitcoin is. Like, should Bitcoin be in the hands of everybody? To what degree? To what level of trust?
And what we want to do with it too. And I
Yeah.
think that James is pointing out something very elementary, but that is very important. Like he's saying we're stuck at this point because we're having to decide what we want to do next, and that's always been the case though. Since
Always been the case.
since the genesis of Bitcoin, that's always been the case. And that's not to deride what he's saying here because again, it's elementary, but it's really important. And sometimes the most important points are elementary. But this is a very, I think, lucid kind of introspective article that he's written saying that these are problems that we've always had, but now we have them kind of to a degree. We've always had these problems, but there's a new problem now where there is no benevolent dictator. There is no consensus or lead maintainer at Bitcoin Core saying, what about this next? Right. And I think this has really turned a lot of people off with regard to both how CTV and OpCat have been marketed. People got pissed off at Jeremy for going to miners and for really advocating for OpCTV, and they said you shouldn't be doing that. You're too emotionally attached to this thing. And on the flip side, you've had a lot of people pissed off at Udi and Eric and the Taproot Wizards folks for pushing forward what they think is the most important thing to activate. But at the same time, their advocacy has also won them over a lot of really impressive developers to go work at Taproot Wizards.
Yeah. It's as Steve Ballmer puts it, imagine I'm sweating and I'm screaming on stage and it's the 90s. Developers. Who's hiring all the developers? Even the developers who are working on very conventionally like hardcore laser ride products are going to the Taproot Wizards. Look at Ben Carmen, who co-founder of Mutiny Wallet. Like,
Yep.
that was one of the. I feel like Luke Skywalker saying like you were one of the good ones, or I don't know who said that, but you know what I mean. Like,
right.
Like, he's going over, and you see that the money and the energy and the excitement. Yeah.
This is a really important point because one of the things that James talks about in the thread is how draining and demoralizing working on core can be because
Yeah.
there's so much dysfunction. There's so much stonewalling of ideas. There are so many competing ideas in this marketplace that you cannot hold on to one. And it must be super refreshing for some of these developers to look at a well-capitalized business like Taproot Wizards that has a lot of energy, that seems to be fun to work for, and it's kind of revitalizing their work ethic to put in the hours that they need to advance this protocol. I mean, it is rigorous. It is demanding. There are very few people who can do it. And like at the end of the day, the discord of something like the open source nature of Bitcoin with all of these competing interests and all of these competing voices and all of these really opinionated, really smart people, it's probably really hard to deal with. And it just, kind of rips you in multiple places at once. And then you have this goofy company that has like a coloring book for its roadmap, Taproot Wizards, and it's fun. And there's a unified vision of what you're trying to build. That has to be attractive. I'm not a developer myself, but I could just see that as being an attractive selling point for why you would want to end up going there. And also, you're going to get paid. Like a lot of these Bitcoin core contributors are not getting paid. The majority of them do not have grants, and they are not bankrolled by a private company.
Yeah. You get to work on a shared vision. That's exciting. Where you with the stuff that you're going to work on is probably going to have users if you are able to get a soft fork over the line. Like, this is another thing. Like, developers don't, like, if a developer dies in a forest, does anybody notice? Or developer launches an app in the woods, does it happen or not? Like, this is also the case. Like, there's higher confidence of getting paid, being able to do something innovative, and having users use your product. So who cares if it is very JPEG heavy? Like, this is the case that a lot of people, I think, are looking at. And it's not to say that there aren't other groups which fund developers. Like, there's Chaincode and there's Brink, but these are more, they pretend themselves as more neutral, and to various degrees they may be, but it's like not exciting.
Also, not the salary that you get from a grant like that is not as competitive probably as like as a software company, right? You know?
Yeah, and I can say it, like, some of these companies can be kind of bureaucratic, and they are not necessarily neutral. They're just more narrow in scope, and then deflect anything outside of that narrow scope of vision for what you can work on Bitcoin on. And that's actually frustrated a lot of people. So like, this
sure.
is a reality. And I mean, you mentioned, Colin, you get into this next section of James's post, which is doing the work, doing all this stuff in a poisonous situation is really time consuming and mind melting. He says, I was paid well to do this full time for years, and the process left me disgusted with the dysfunction, having little desire to continue contribution. I think this is a common feeling. And then he says what we were just talking about. A related myth is that businesses will do something analogous to aid the process, that businesses will build on prospective forks. Most Bitcoin companies actually have a ton on their backlog, fighting for survival, and really don't have anyone to dedicate to full-time R&D. The ones who do have R&D are much more like shitcoin factories and don't care about specific Bitcoin upgrades, which is funny because, like, the argument is that the Wizards are the most shitcoin factory adjacent.
Yes.
But, and that is true. They will say we are in the business of producing assets which are not just Bitcoin. But but like, the thing is like, this is very, very true. It is, the Bitcoin ecosystem have learned not to build a company betting that a soft fork will happen. So therefore, everyone, probably wisely, capital allocators included, do not spend any resources towards working on R&D towards any changes to Bitcoin. So then it is rare, in fact, possibly even unique entirely to the Wizards, and maybe like Paul over there at Layer 2 Labs with Drive Chain. Like, these are the only like funded companies that come to my mind, which like are building towards something which cannot be implemented yet.
Yeah, I think so. I think that they're definitely the outliers in a general trend, kind of to his point. I think what James is saying there is kind of a half truth, right? You said it. The Taproot folks are kind of like the shitcoiners of the Bitcoin circle, who are actually working on Bitcoin, because some people think that, JPEGs and stuff are shitcoins. I personally don't have that view. I may not really care about them that much, but it's kind of a weird argument and self-defeating, because at the end of the day, you're not going to stop these things from getting on chain. But the other thing is too, they clearly do, to your point, care about what upgrade gets added next. Taproot Wizards doesn't necessarily need OpCat to be a functioning business, but it would make their business much easier, and would make their roadmap actually, more, I would say, exciting, or, potentially lucrative if it were active, which raises another point entirely. and same thing with Paul at Layer 2 Labs with Bit 300, which like shout out to like the lone man in the wilderness. Like I just don't think that we're ever gonna get
the lone angry man yelling
lone
at the
angry
sun
man.
in the wilderness.
We're just not gonna get that, and I think that he realized that that's not going to happen, at least through the conventional means. So that's why he had this talk about a core, untouched, activated soft fork at
A developer
OpNext.
scorned is something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I recommend y'all listen to that talk because it's a very interesting idea,
Yeah.
but probably a lot of criticisms to it. It engendered a lot of conversation. But anyway, just a final point here. On the one hand, it's not necessarily good to have Bitcoin Core be the driving factor of an upgrade. On the other hand, do we really want private companies leading this discussion if their championed soft fork makes their business viable or gives them a head start on other people or makes them money? I don't really think that's ideal either. It's almost this like lesser, it's not a lesser of two evils, but there's this kind of like picture poison, or like
Yeah.
it's again it's like
a
idealism
poison.
versus pragmatism, right? Where it's like ideally both of these have equal weight and it's a tug of war and like the most meritocratic wins, but that's just not the world we live in. And so maybe the point is that in different points in Bitcoin's development and different points in time, you're going to have one model win out over the other. Now, I think the important point here is that for the current soft forks being proposed, like CTV, OpCat, the Great Consensus Cleanup is kind of its own thing. But with those two for, improving Bitcoin computationally, they're pretty vanilla. These OpCat's already been in Bitcoin. We know that it's not going to break it. OpCTV, there aren't really any good arguments against it. As Peter Todd said during our panel, the best argument against it when it was proposed is that it doesn't really necessarily do anything that people want. Now we have a lot of potential use cases that could leverage it. So for these soft forks, companies currying or companies advocating for one over the other is not really dangerous. But in the future, you could see it being something that could turn people off or be potentially detrimental.
Yeah, it's interesting. We do have now, I would say, several companies. I'm gonna just pick Alex with Arc Labs, who's on this podcast recently. Arc's implementing an Arc on Bitcoin, which works today, but it could be dramatically improved with a soft fork, specifically CTV. It would also be improved with Cat. But it's interesting because like now you have more of these, I would say, UTXO extension type systems, Lightning companies included, where they're raising money and they're hiring good devs and there's energy behind it, and they are trying to onboard their position to onboard users well, and they would be benefited by a soft fork. Peter Todd does make a good point with his comment on, years ago there wasn't as much of a reason to do CTV, and now there is. Again, sometimes this feels like a bit like a semantics issue, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it is kind of a pick your poison. Also, like, why are we even talking about any of this stuff? Because the Wizards raised several $1 million and then like literally jump started this dead discussion. I'm not saying it wasn't totally dead, but like it was not moving
It was
forward.
dormant.
It was
dormant.
very, very, yeah. It was in hibernation. And so they still carry like the rod. They're usually the first money through the door for these dev conferences. Look, they sponsored OpNext, they sponsored TabConf, they sponsored BTC++. These are the North American developer focused conferences, and they want to put their name and say we want to do these things. And then they also, they don't suck all the air out of the room in these. I'm just gonna be very frank and say I think like they've been sending their dev sides of the team, less of the incendiary Udi and Eric people to these conferences. And it's like, and they've managed to navigate that pretty well. But like, still, this is a fraught discussion and it's draining. And who in their right mind, if you weren't some kind of masochist, want to engage with the business of trying to champion a soft fork, So,
Right.
There is I'll also move on to the other section where this actually mirrors a bit what Rusty Russell talked about in the panel. So James says, the current mechanism for changing Bitcoin hinges on what core developers will merge. This, of course, isn't official policy, but it's the unintended reality. Less savvy actors like miners and exchanges, and maybe even users, have to pick some indicator to pay attention to that tells them what changes are safe and what are coming. They don't want to size these up for. They don't want to size these up for themselves. Core developers will bristle at this characterization. They'll say, we're just janitors. We just merge what has consensus. And they're not being disingenuous in saying that, but they're also not acknowledging that historically, this is how consensus changes have operated. And Rusty says kind of the inverse of this in his panel on Up Next, where he said, developers may not push forward changes, but they definitely have and can veto them de facto.
Yeah, they have the power to veto. And it's not like I think people hear that and they think it's some sort of concrete process, but it's literally just them being in the IRC chat or in the dev mailing list and being like, this is dumb. Here's why we shouldn't do this. And then other people agree or disagree. I thought Rusty's point on the panel was really interesting because it flies in the face of the typical argument about activation is that who is the veto boogeyman? It's the mining industry, right? Like ever since SegWit, there is this like deeply entrenched fear, almost like a generational trauma type response to this idea that anything that's good for Bitcoin, the miners can just say, no, we don't want that. And for SegWit, of course, because SegWit invalidated ASIC Boost, which was giving Bitmain a leg up against all of their competition with regards to mining. Like 100%. There's also the idea that a block size increase would give them less fee revenue. Also true. So like those two things, sure. I think the mining industry is much different now. Peter, Todd seemed to disagree with me on this during our panel.
Yeah, I disagree. I personally disagree with Peter on this. Jay said, yeah.
Well, he said it's like there's no difference between then and now. Jay kind of met us in the middle. There are things that are similar. There are things that are different. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of Bitcoin miners, and James kind of points this out, they really don't know how all this stuff works. They're very technically illiterate. People, I think, Bitcoiners to this day, even some of the core developers like Luke, and maybe I shouldn't speak for Luke here, but some Bitcoiners have this image of a miner as like a guy in a hoodie who hasn't showered in a week and is running a bunch of S19s in his basement. When in reality,
and has read every book on game theory and imagine 100%. And is constantly watching Bitcoin for their optimal decision.
And is relaying their own transactions through their own node and signing their own blocks and building their own templates. When in reality, it's like a boomer in a suit whose son-in-law told him to pour $1 million and do like an off-grid mining site in Texas.
And he's like, and he spends all this time at the Texas Railroad Commission arguing with the commissioner, and does not have a Twitter account, and may for the first time install Telegram to buy $20 million worth of overpriced S19J Pros.
Yeah, right.
That's not game theory, guys.
No, the biggest miners in the game currently are suits, and they are people with a lot of capital who can deploy machines at scale. And that doesn't mean that there obviously are a lot of other miners too who are like more aligned with Bitcoin and very technically savvy, things like that. But like a lot of the biggest miners around the world are people with a lot of money who want to make a lot more money. And Bitcoin is their vessel, or Bitcoin mining, I should say, is their vessel through which they are going to sail into Valhalla, right? Like that is how they approach it. And so they are not tuned into these discussions at all. And so there is a benefit. There's something negative about that, but there's also a positive. The positive is that if you come to them and say, this benefits Bitcoin, it's going to help with adoption, please accept it, then the mining pools are going to be like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll do that. But that's even another choke point. It's almost like talking about the miners in general is irrelevant. And I think Reardon called them template producers, which I think is a fun new
template producers and payout coordinators.
Yeah, fun new phrase to add to the lexicon. But, you know, you really have to convince the mining pools of these things. And the mining pools are not going to do things that piss off their users. And in the same way that some of them, they're more technically literate, less technically literate, more institutional, less institutional. But the mining pools are ultimately going to probably do things that are no-brainers if the rest of the community is saying that they're okay with them.
Yeah, I mean, my spicy take is like, I think the miners wouldn't really know anything about a soft fork. People just be like, say, we're soft working, we're soft working on this day, and the miners would be like, okay. No one would have like, you'd have like a handful of Ocean people and about 200 BitAxe runners who like who just twist themselves up into knots, consumed by this. On the subject of the BitAxe people, like another one of my takes is like, I think one of the best things that some of these mining pools could do is actually hire some of these like BitAxe enthusiasts, because it's increasingly popular. If you're a miner, if you made it this far in the conversation, like, you guys should reach out and engage some of these like hyper active like BitAxe home miner people who study and agonize over all the details of how Bitcoin mining works and game theory and pool payouts and consensus, because like, I think it's going to better your company. I think every like big major mining operation should have like a token like hardcore Bitcoin mining game theorist to be on the inside to help them.
For every mining company a maxi. I generally agree with that. And one more point to make on the pool front. You know, you said the miners are going to be like, okay, when an upgrade comes through. I think generally that's true. I mean, that's kind of what happened with Taproot, but there's a crucial piece missing, I think, from that analysis, is the fact that one man was kind of responsible for being the liaison between the IRC lurking developers and technical enthusiasts and the Bitcoin mining pools.
And who was that?
Alejandro de la Torre, formerly of Poolin. Now he is bootstrapping Demand Pool. He was like the go-between.
He literally explained to all the Chinese pools.
Yeah. He was to the mining industry.
Or formerly Poolin, yeah.
Yeah, formerly Poolin. He was to the mining industry and the mining pool, specifically what JD Vance is to Trump. He was like the translator. He was the tech whisperer who was able to tell them, here's what the developers and the technically tuned in are saying. Here's what Taproot will do. Here's how they are saying they want to activate it. And without
just the fact that we got to this far in the discussion on activation and everything and haven't mentioned Alejandro de la Torre. In fact, that I would say most people probably in this conversation have no idea who he is or where, like, anything that he did. This is probably one of the biggest missing pieces.
Yeah. Which is kind of like, it's kind of scary, you know. It's like a wrecking ball that is held together with like 1,000 paper clips or something, or like a single piece of twine.
Everybody over here is like agonizing over like what the wrecking ball should do, and then like doesn't realize that somebody has to drive the crane that makes
100%. Yeah. And I think that, you know, the question then becomes who's going to do that liaising for the next soft fork, because, you know, the panel that I hosted was on activation and other scary words. And there are really two primary ways that Bitcoin, I would say primary in the sense of like, have been discussed the most and make the most sense. User activated soft fork, where, you know, node operators update to a fork client, and then like they basically say, I'm only going to accept blocks that use this client, that use this, or that have upgraded. I'm only going to accept blocks from miners that conform to this version of Bitcoin. Or miner activated soft fork, where you get the miners on board and they signal their support for it and upgrade accordingly. The latter of those, while not totally palatable to most people, is probably the least disruptive, and is the one that like is most desirable to make sure that there isn't a chain split, because you just want these people on board. And I think that for future soft forks, like, we really do need to make sure that the Bitcoin core community and that the people who are advocating for a fork and who are developing it are closely in contact with these mining pools, because they're kind of like a reality that you can't ignore, right? It would have been much easier in the early days when Bitcoin was all of 1,000 people maybe, and like 10 of those were major stakeholders to upgrade. But it's not 2012 or 2013 anymore, right? It's a much bigger, it's a much bigger landscape, and you kind of have to go through the pools if you want something to go through smoothly. That's not to say that you have to do that, but it would make things much easier.
Yeah. I think I kind of want to try to wrap this conversation up, but James wraps this up really well, where he says, I do not know what the solution to any of this is. I do know that self-custody is totally nerve-wracking and basically out of the question for casual users. I would make an asterisk, casual users who aren't NFT power users. And I do know that Bitcoin in its current form will not scale to twice monthly volume for even 10% of the US, let alone most of the world. Listen to that. That is a ballpark rough estimate for what it would look like for a percentage of the United States to use on-chain Bitcoin a few times a month. Like, that's kind of the maximum like amount of transactions you can have. So, and I know everyone's just going to say lightning, but like, okay, what if we want to open and close Lightning channels? Whatever. People don't
Lightning
know.
Service providers, bro.
Centralized. Okay, so pro centralization. Okay.
I mean, I didn't say that, but I do think that the Bitcoin's not going to scale thing is somewhat of a red herring. It's just a matter of, is it going to scale in a way that you agree with, right? Like, for the majority of people, I still hold, like, even if custody were better and even if we had better throughput and better layer twos, the vast majority of people are just not going to custody their own Bitcoin. So
yeah,
like, that's not ideal, but I do think that that's realistic. But anyway, continue with what you were going to say.
Yeah. So he says most of the long-standing, fully specified fork proposals active today are totally fine, and conceptually they'd be great additions to Bitcoin. He does even make a block size reference, which I will not repeat on here. Compact blocks and assume UTXO and eventually UTXO, but those are another post for another day. I've gone back and forth writing a post like this because I don't have any concrete prescriptions or recommendations. I only hope that that bringing up these uncomfortable observations is some distant precursor to making progress on scaling self-custody. He says he's just tired of biting his tongue. So, yeah.
Can I make a point really quickly about big
Go
blocks?
for it.
I feel like big blocks in Bitcoin are the equivalent to Trump support currently, where it's like the Overton window is shifted and there's less social stigma, and you're seeing a lot more people talk about increasing Bitcoin's block size. I think we're kind of moving out of the fog of the SegWit and No2x thing, and people are looking at it a little more critically. I don't really have a dog in the fight. I think that there are pros and cons to both. I think the one negative potentially about a block size increase is that you hamper miner revenue, and like, it's no guarantee that we're actually going to have the adoption curve that will increase transaction fees for miners when the subsidy is totally gone. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I am glad that we can go back to kind of politely arguing and discussing block size increases. I think it's kind of weird that you just weren't allowed to talk about it without being totally cast out.
Totally
you could have like a
verboten.
bunch of really good opinions and that, but the thing is that the longer we go without a soft fork to scale on-chain self-custody and on-chain access to people, the more enticing a block size increase becomes. So in a way, it becomes a bit of a what do you call a game of chicken, where like the longer you go, the more you're going to see the block size voices sound less crazy. So maybe, yeah.
And you've made this point before. I don't know what's going to push people over the edge for wanting to upgrade, or what's going to give them the impetus to do it. You've made the point that if transaction fees rip in this bull run with a bunch of on-chain activity and make Bitcoin unusable for certain swaths of the population, that will certainly light a fire under people's asses. I want to echo something that Shinobi said on our spaces yesterday with Reardon and a bunch of the other technical folks from the conference and some other, great speakers that we had in that space. I've thought about this too, and I think it really bears saying, like, I don't want to like be an alarmist and say we're running out of time, but every day we spend quibbling about what we want to do next is another day that we've lost to push forward features and upgrades that will legitimately help Bitcoin. And the more institutionalized and the larger this thing becomes, and the more stakeholders within the legacy realm of finance and government is involved in Bitcoin, the harder it's going to be to push forward these things. Because when you get like, let's just like fast forward like 5 years, 6 years, 7 years from now, if Bitcoin overtakes gold's market cap, which I feel like that's at least like that's gonna
that could happen very soon. Like
that could happen very soon,
really soon.
And it's not an outlandish thing to suggest happening. Like last bull run, that might have been outlandish for some people. I don't think it is. And if we get to that point and every single fucking bank is custodying this thing and has their fingers in it, do you think they're going to tolerate this slapdash, upgrade process where a bunch of screeching autists are online trying to advocate for something and they're like, oh, hang on, wait a second. Who gets to decide what we're doing next with it?
Fuck no, we're not going to do that. We have $400 billion of BlackRock assets.
Yeah. Like when Bitcoin is a multi-trillion-dollar asset, it already is. When it has the market, when it's at a 15, 17, $20 trillion market cap, it's going to be extremely difficult to call all of these disparate interest groups who have a lot of money at stake and tell them, hey, yeah, this $20 trillion asset, guess what? This dude in a hoodie who gets paid $100,000 a year is going to decide the future of the functions on this network.
Also,
that's just not going to fly.
Also, he's been tweeting that he wants you guys to die for the past decade. Like you, that's like what it is. So as Shinobi says, quit being pussies. Like you just put your big boy pants on and just realize that the clock is ticking. It may have already stopped. Like, so we may be now in like extended. I mean, maybe I'm overreacting. We might be in whatever you call the extra time at the end of the game. I don't know sports.
Overtime. They do call it extra time in Europe, in the EU. I do think that we really want to be doing some of these things sooner rather than later, especially with for things like quantum resistance, the great consensus cleanup and stuff like that. I think that will have less pushback from vested interests that don't understand any of this shit, like the BlackRocks of the world. That's going to be something that clearly is in their best interest to upgrade. Things like covenants, which improve custody and scaling and directly compete with their ability to vacuum up as much of this asset as possible. Like they're going to not be okay with that. And at the end of the day, with all this quibbling about like one node, one vote, and like, well, who decides which Bitcoin is Bitcoin? Ultimately, the market decides. Ultimately, whichever ticker ends up being purchased more ends up becoming the longest chain and becomes the canonical Bitcoin. So like if half of all Bitcoin is custodied by like a BlackRock, like you think that you're going to have any say in how to change this thing? No, unless you want to join the minority coin. So like we need to do something sooner rather than later, because it's going to be really fucking hard to do it next cycle. It's going to be really fucking hard to do it.
Yeah, dude, next cycle is going to be, don't even want to think about it. We're going to have to actually cut our hair, Colin. We're going to have to put on suits. We're going to have to advocate at the world, I don't know, the
World Economic
Forum. That's what's gonna happen though. Is we're gonna do the math, man. If we're at $20 trillion, that's a simple 20x from here. But this is what Bitcoin does. We're $20 trillion. We're gonna have like freaking diplomats from the Republic of Texas going to Qatar, and they're gonna meet with the Saudis, and they're gonna like sit down about a big creepy round table, and the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world will be in the same room trying to subvert your plans. And like those are the next bosses who you'll have to directly compete against in a shadow game of diplomacy and energetic power. Jason Lowry will be the voice
Jason
of Bitcoin.
Lowry will be sitting on a throne, like getting like massaged, you know, by like, you know, some like Jeffrey Epstein adjacent sycophant. And all of the hardcore Bitcoiners are going to be shuffling in with shaved heads and robes,
Yeah.
like the
Like
religious
the
order
chain
from Game of
gang
Thrones.
Bitcoin devs will be brought in, and they'll say, "Make Bitcoin faster, make us hash more." And they'll be, "We can't do that, sir."
And then you'll have Alex Jones in the wings. I told you the globalists were going to eat everything. They were going to take over the software.
That's actually what's going to happen. So you heard it here first.
You heard it here first. We are writing what we see on the wall. We are not willing